All right, let me get on with part 5 of this series about the Bronze Age collapse, and this is going to be the final part for now. I will be adding a few parts later on, but I first want to publish this and see what happens and see if there's any response to all this. And then later I will come with my conclusions about these matters and their relevance for today. And also I will start introducing some other threads, namely the stories of the giants and the Nephilim, which are also, you know, something that the Bible talks about and how it all relates. And also very much, by the way, about Moloch worship and Baal worship, because these are interesting issues that we need to discuss to get a clear view of what actually transpired in those days. And but that is really a different story, perhaps. And also my conclusions are my own. Everybody must come to his own conclusions in these matters, and I'm very interested to hear from other people what they think. And if anybody can find an argument against all these things that I've brought forward. And okay, so on with the chronology, and let me first show you the basic chronology. You can see it here. You can you know, get a better view by pausing if you want, but let me point out the basic problem that we need to fix, and which is in the era until about Solomon. Solomon is basically the first period in the Israelite history that we are very sure that we can prove his existence and validate the biblical account for 100% certainty. And this is simply related to his temple, which was built in, I just looked it up. Where is it? Yeah, here. 957 BCE. So that's when, you know, before then there are also many clues and a fair bit of information, but this is when all of mainstream science fully supports anything, the basic narrative basically, that there was a temple, that there was a kingdom of Israel, that there was a kingdom of Judah, and that these kings lived. Saul is said to have died in around 10 BCE. That's what people say now, but we will be talking about that as well. Because things are not clear there either, but this is what is at stake, this period here in the biblical timeline. And it begins, of course, with the idea that Moses was born, yeah, well, if Exodus was 1447, then Moses must have been born 1567, and 1567 and Exodus 1447 and before Christ, and ultimately the conquest of Canaan in around 1400 BCE. According to this timeline, you have other timelines which are somewhat different, but it's all in the same order of magnitude. And this is not where I want to go. What I want to show is this is the problem. Yeah, I want to go here. This is the problem. Because this is what we know was the situation in 1450 BC and also still in 1400 BC. This was the situation basically until 1177 BC. Only the Mitanni state in the meantime disappeared, and the situation here, there was a new Assyrian empire that had overtaken Babylonia by the time of 1177. But this is basically still the situation in 1177, and what we can see clearly here is that the Hittite Empire is thriving and fully in control of its core territory, and it will expand a little bit until Kadesh here a little later. But this is the situation, and there is no proof whatsoever of any assault by Moses destroying the Hittites in 1400 BC. None whatsoever. This is the problem. This is where it all goes wrong. And it must be made very clear that this biblical timeline is a commentary on the Bible. It is not part of the Bible. The biblical timeline was created by the church fathers and by rabbis. Commentaries on the Bible and speculations about these earlier events, either because they didn't know or because they were sabotaging the situation. Both are possible. The latter is perhaps plausible. And this is what we have to solve, this problem of if Moses was living here, why did nothing happen? And of course, as we have already shown, we can validate it in his account in 1177. So either the Bible is wrong and whatever Moses and Joshua are claiming that they have achieved is nonsense, or the biblical timeline is wrong, saying that Moses lived in the 15th century BC instead of dying in 1177 before Christ, at the eve of the Bronze Age collapse and at the eve of the Canaanite conquest. So which one is it? And obviously, we have shown that we can validate Moses' account and that it must have happened in 1177 BC. Therefore, the biblical timeline must be wrong. Very clearly so. And we can very clearly show why it is wrong. Because there are two major issues that happen here. In the first place, I want to show you this. The United Kingdom, and then you have the few kings here. There are more after that, of course, but is preceded by the judges. And the judges is a series of tribal leaders. Well, there was a hierarchy of judges. There were local judges who were in charge of 8 or 10 people. And then you had a higher judge who was in charge of 100 people. Then you had a higher judge who was in charge of the tribe or whatever. And ultimately, all these judges, these lower judges, were headed by the supreme judge, and that is then the different series of different judges that is described in the Book of Judges. And this then is said to have lasted from 1380 until 1050, because in 1050 they think that Saul took over power as the first king of Israel. But these are the judges that we were talking about. And now we can introduce a very important problem in chronology in the Bible, and that is the concept of the generation. As we were already saying, in the Bible, a generation is 40 years. And this is a convention, I must say. This is a convention. And they all do it. All the different writers of the Bible use this 40 years for the generations. And therefore, it is also used here. As you can see, what really happened here, they say these years as a judge, but that is because the Bible somehow says it's a generation, and they do not know how long he really ruled. And then, you know, it's just one term as a judge, which was basically for life. Once you made it as a judge, it was for life, or you got killed in battle, or because these men were warlords, let there be no mistake. And they could be killed in battle, or they died of old age or whatever, but and they didn't know how long they ruled. And that's when they say, oh, it's just one administration, therefore that's one generation. And a generation is 40 years. But when you go look at judges of which we know how long they ruled, then you can see that on average, these different administrations lasted for far shorter than 40, 80 or 40 years of the guys of which they're making an estimation by saying it's a generation. And this Ehud character, he ruled basically for 2 generations, so he must have been in charge for a relatively long time, and therefore they call it 2 generations. But this generations is the fact that this is now 80 years. This is not believable. We can see here that some guys just rule for a couple of years, others rule for maybe 20 years, but that was about as far as it went. 22, 23 years. So not 40 years, and most certainly not 80 years. Maybe this guy ruled for 30 years or 35 years in an exceptionally long administration. But if we take the average of the years of the people of whom we know how long they ruled, these guys here, and one woman, because there's also Deborah. Okay, she's one of the 40s here. But of these guys mostly here, then this is the average of these numbers is 11.2. So that was the average span of a generation, what in the Bible is called a generation. And this has many implications, because you can see that if 11.2 is the average, and these guys are given 40 years for a period which on average will likely have lasted 40 years here, and in this case then 22 years, 22.4 years, you can see how easily the timeline immensely balloons. In fact, if you calculate it, the timeline becomes 144 years longer, the biblical timeline, than it really is. And here you see that the judges are said to have ruled little more than 3 centuries. So half of this timeline, of this vast period in time, which is, you know, as we now know, simply wrong, because the Canaanite conquest was in 1150. So they didn't start ruling in 1380. They started ruling in 1150. That's when the judges started ruling. And they ruled for about, say, 150 years, because around 1000 BC, and not 1050 BC, I think it must have been 1000 BC. This is when Saul comes, because here too you can see the problem. Saul here is 1050 to 1010, is a generation, is 40 years. This is not the length of his reign. It is just one generation, which is therefore automatically made 40 years by these biblical scholars, but which is irrelevant. Saul too will have ruled a far shorter period of time. David, same problem, 1010, 970. He will not have ruled 40 years. Solomon, same story, 40 years. So 39 years, because, you know, things go wrong with Solomon, but it's a generation, and this will be wrong too. This is an assumption, but it's a fair estimation, because otherwise this is simply inexplicable. A simple glance learns that this is inexplicable. Otherwise, if you think about this, it's impossible that that you have this kind of. Excuse me, my cat's making a mess there. I'll check out what she's doing later on. And this is what we're dealing with here. This is an estimation that we must do away with. And what I've done here is, I'll show you. I've simply calculated the average, and we have had 15 judges. If we look here, if we look here, these are 15 judges. So the total period, and if you have then an average of 12.2 years, so this corrects this generation problem, then the total period of the judges must have been anywhere around 168 years. Can be 10 years more, maybe even 20 years more. Can also be a couple of years shorter, but it will have been something like this, and not this 300 years that you see in the timeline. And this is caused by this generation problem. And this generation problem is also relevant in another issue, namely Moses' lifespan, because Moses is said to have lived for 120 years. And this is theoretically possible, also for an old man in the desert. I mean, it is theoretically possible, but 120 years is also what the Bible itself says is the maximum lifespan of a man. Somewhere in the Bible, God says, I will make the maximum lifespan of men 120 years. Earlier, they could become much older, but as of that time, even before the flood, God made this decision. I think it was before the flood, but I'm not even too sure about that. And so this is something that the Bible scholars would have used, and the writers of the Bible. And this 120 years is also 3 generations. 3 times 40. So, you know, if you look at it this way, and if you see the problems that this generation's business creates, and you know, what seems to have happened is that these people, they had a clear record of who. Also, earlier in the Bible, you see these endless, you know, series of you know, what I wrote down here. In the first place, you know, these famous for expositions of bloodlines. John begat Jack, who begat Joe, who begat Jake, etc., etc., etc. And they have these endless expositions, and they knew this, but they were not aware of the exact years of their, not maybe even lifespans, but their years as their men in their, you know, in the years that they were in leading groups, leading the tribes, leading the nations, or the nation of Israel. So everything is 40 years, or if it was two generations that he ruled, a long period that he ruled, then it would have made 80 years. But probably this guy actually ruled for 30 years, and that would have been like, you know, major at the time. So this is clearly what seems to have happened. I hope that everybody understands this, what I'm doing here, because it is very simple and to the point, very simple and obvious. And it is basically very strange that that serious scholars and serious students of history and the Bible, etc., have not noted this. Probably they did elsewhere, but this has remained the convention. But this is ridiculous, really, to be honest. You know, I mean, let's face it. This is not reliable, quite clearly, and we have fixed it in this way. What we're doing here, by saying the average is 11.2 years per judge that we know of, and then extrapolate that to the ones that we do not know of, this is a fair thing to do mathematically and statistically. And of course, it will not mean that, you know, the actual average will be exactly 11.2 years, but it is much closer to the truth than saying 40, 40, 40, and 80 years. And we see the problem it generates because the timeline starts ballooning immensely into the past, far too much so. Okay. Next point. There's also an issue of literary embellishment and somehow a desire to create a very neat calendar in time of Anno Mundi. That is, you know, in biblical terms, the phrase for when the earth was created, which is, you know, traditionally, or not, perhaps not even known, because biblical scholars will not claim to exactly know. But there is a, you know, what Genesis 1 says about, you know, there was the void and the 7 days that in which creation, etc., etc. This is known as Anno Mundi. This event was dated Anno Mundi. This in biblical lore. And then you have, for instance, the situation that they say that Exodus, which according to this timeline is in 1447, which is, you know, a couple of millennia after Anno Mundi, in the perspective of the biblical scholars behind this mode of thinking. And they will next say, oh, you know, it's Exodus happens exactly 2/3 of the first 4,000 years. And they claim this as proof about the divine plan. Oh, look how beautiful, you know, I mean, everything fits like clockwork, and God has got it all figured out. And this is what these rabbis and these scribes, you know, that make these timelines have been up to. And obviously this is not real. This is just not real. And what we're going to show is the date of Exodus. And I can make a very, very strong case, actually, a little bonus revelation here, because let's go fix this biblical timeline. And I've made a beginning here. Moses dies 11. This is what we simply can state. Moses died 1177 BC, because we know that he died at the eve of the Bronze Age collapse, and therefore must have been 1177 BC. Now, if we're going to assume that Moses indeed lived 120 years, which seems quite unlikely, to be honest. But then we can say that he was born in 1257 BC and not in 1567 BC, let alone in the 1590s, what Jerome was saying. We can also say the wandering in the desert lasted for a generation, 40 years. So the Exodus must have happened 40 years earlier than 1177. Must have been. Excuse me, I dropped my mouse here. But must have been in 1217 BC. This other date I will be getting to, because this is funny stuff. This we know, we have been discussing the problem of the generation, and we already see, and we can see this is happening here too. This wandering in the desert, etc., have lasted a generation, but by now we can say, well, that's probably not what happened. I mean, they call it a generation because it lasted for a generation of maybe an administration of a leader, or you know, what was an actual generation at the time, which was probably close to 20 years actually. You know, young people becoming adults. People in those days married at about 16, so they would have children in the years after that. So a generation would have been closer to 20 years, but and it would have been fairly arbitrary. A long period and associated with the leadership of a man, that would have been called a generation. So this is what happens here too. So it must have been around 1217 if we simply go with the 40 years, but we need more. We need a little more to because we can't even prove Exodus, of course. So we have proven the Bronze Age collapse and that this is the Canaanite conquest. That is what we have proven, but not Exodus. And but I'm not saying it did not happen, far from it. In fact, I'm going to show you some very spicy bit of evidence, which is really quite remarkable, and further validating Moses' story, and also further validating our narrative here of the Bronze Age collapse is the Canaanite conquest. Namely, as I previously already stated, there is only one source, one Egyptian record that outright names Israel. They may have been talking about Israel in other records as well, but using a different name that we simply do not recognize. This is possible, but the name Israel is shown in Egyptian records only once. And it is shown in a famous text, which is known as the Merneptah Stele. Well, my Egyptian is not what it used to be, so you'll have to forgive my pronunciation here. But the Merneptah Stele, that is what it was called. And let me show you here what the situation is about. Oh, hang on. There's this article here that I need to be showing you. Exactly, the Merneptah Stele. Okay, you can look it up on the internet. And this text is known to have been created anywhere between 1208 and 1203 BC. So that's, if we go with 1208, that's 31 years before the Bronze Age collapse of 1177 BC. 1177 BC, 1208 BC. And if we know that this 40 years is absolutely not set in stone, then surely this is amazing. And it is amazing I'll show you how amazing it is, because this is what the Merneptah Stele has to say. The Merneptah Stele has to say, the princes are prostrate, saying, peace. Not one is raising his head among the 9 bows. Now that Tehenu has come to ruin, Hatti is pacified. The Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam has made non-existent. Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. Huru is become a widow because of Egypt. This is the text that the Egyptians have left us in 1208 BC. And let me just walk you through this and tell you what's up. Tehenu is a place in Libya, apparently. Hatti are the Hittites. So, you know, this is just one more skirmish with the Hittites after the Battle of Kadesh, somewhere, anywhere in Canaan, probably close to the Hittite border, because, well, we don't know, you know, I mean, it could have been anywhere in Canaan, but, you know, we've seen the situation in Canaan at the time. So that's where these struggles with the Hatti, the Hittites, took place. Ashkelon, famous place in Canaan. Gezer, place in Canaan. Yanoam in Canaan. Israel is laid to waste, and his seed is not. And this is now, and Huru is also a Canaanite tribe. So everything is happening in Canaan and in Libya. These are the two places where it happens. And what this basically says is a boasting king for posterity, for domestic consumption, for war propaganda. We defeated all these enemies. This is our glory. And also Israel is laid to waste and his seed is not. And the first thing that we can say about this is that it is a lie. Because Israel survived and Israel lived and Israel became the dominant power in Canaan. So they were clearly not laid waste and his seed clearly still was. So it's a lie and it's basically propaganda. We don't even know what happened to these people. Could all be lies. Could be some truth in it. Some could be true, others could be lies. We just don't know. As we have seen very clearly also in the event of Kadesh, and that's why I shared this with you. These people are just making it up, or at any rate, they're not making it up. They're framing things. They're in the business of propaganda, because this is not a historian writing this. This is a king. This is government. And we know about government, don't we? So this was ongoing then, 3,000 years ago, and it is ongoing still very much so today, as we all know. So nothing strange going on here. And I want to do some framing of my own. And I'm going to suggest something, as I said here. We have already seen how it works. And what's something like this happening? Translating as follows: there was a humiliating scandal with the Israelites who managed to leave Egypt. Egyptian forces followed them but lost them in the desert. Moses escaped, and the Egyptians, after coming out of the other side of the Sinai desert in Canaan, took out their chagrin on some minor locals. That's basically how you can plausibly read this. The only mention of Israel in all of Egypt's records, which go back millennia. And again, as I also have already said, but let's stress this, we see that Israel was a known power in the area around 1000 BC, 1000 BC. And even then, Egyptian records do not mention Israel. Even though they coexist, maybe not on particularly friendly terms, but they coexist for many decades, really, maybe centuries even. And in no record of Egypt is Israel mentioned again after this. So it must have been a big event that this is referring to, and that this is framing, and that this is propagandizing about. Must have been a big event, otherwise it wouldn't have been mentioned here. So what we have is the only mention of Israel's in all Egyptian records is about 30 years before the Bronze Age collapse, which is about a generation in biblical terms, because again, this 40 years business is nonsense. Could have been substantially shorter. And but it must have been quite a while, you know. It's not like it was over in a couple of weeks and then they call it generation and it's going to be 40 years instead of a few weeks. No, they lasted in the desert for 10, 20, 30 years. And then this is automatically called a generation because for some reason they have difficulty with, also very much in the Bible itself, with dates for whatever reason. God only knows why, but they do have this problem and they solve it with this generations issue. Solve it, creating new problems. So there is this one record of Israelite of Egyptian history, this Merneptah Stele, stating this bit about Israel here. Israel is laid waste. Yeah, that could well have been referring to Exodus. Could very well have been. I'm not saying it does, because there's simply too little information here, very clearly so. But if I do a bit of framing of my own, it is anecdotal evidence for certain. And you know, considering that in the Bible, in the Torah, the Exodus, the wandering, and the next, the Canaanite conquest, these are the key events. And the key event in which both Egypt and Israel were involved was the escape from Egypt and the failure of the pursuing pharaonic troops to deal with this desertion. So it was a big thing in Israelite history. Second book of the Bible is about it, Exodus. And it would have been a big thing in Egypt as well. So it is plausible, and suddenly things start to make sense, you know. I mean, again, if you look in 1500 in BC in Egyptian records, you find nothing. Well, according to the official narrative, the Exodus and the Canaanite conquest should have taken place then. So I think it is very plausible indeed, and I think it is a strong circumstantial evidence, let me put it this way, notable circumstantial evidence that this particular bit of Egyptian agitprop, because this is propaganda, not the truth, not factual, is about the Exodus. I think it is very plausible, and it certainly fits perfectly with everything that we're saying. So we're going to place Exodus 1208 and not 1217. I'm going to remove this again. And then, of course, this 1208 is not written in stone either, because as we have seen, the Merneptah Stele is said to be from either 1208 or 1203. So, you know, as with everything, these dates, they're not exact. It's not an exact science, but it's an order of magnitude that we're discussing here. And in terms of the order of magnitude, it fits absolutely perfectly. So that's very notable, and things start to make far more sense now. This is why we have this one record of Israel, because it was actually dealing with the Exodus, the key event in history where Egypt and Israel, you know, were parting ways, and which was humiliating for the Pharaoh, no doubt, because these people were supposed to be under his control, and the ruler does not want to see people go against his will. And yeah, this is how Egyptian propaganda dealt with it. And but the fact that they mention it, that they mention Israel at this particular crucial time in our own timeline, is very interesting. And I think that we can say with a fair bit of certainty that that Exodus was actually happening in that year. And I think that this much improves anything that we know about when Exodus actually did happen. Okay. So, so this is basically our basic repairment of the biblical timeline. We're going to say that the birth of Moses was about 1157. He died in 1177. Exodus happened in 1208 BC. And the Canaanite conquest lasted for a couple of years because, let's have a look at this again. Excuse me, but Bronze Age collapse, this map here. This by now famous map. We've been looking at so much. Sorry that I have to look this up. I didn't prepare this, but as you can see, this is a lot of work. All these are, okay, Troy, we must not include Troy, and also Hattusa. It's far from clear that that Israel actually was behind the destruction of Hattusa. Apparently, mainstream history sees it as a feat of the Thracians, and but this was indeed the work of Joshua, and this is where the mainstay of Hittite power was broken, as you can clearly see here. And you know, traveling from here to there, that would have been a few weeks, a couple of months even, and supplies, as I said, everything. So that's not a matter of one campaigning season. That takes decades. For instance, also if you compare the Dutch 80-year war, even with gunpowder, but there was a many years long process in the south of the Netherlands in the 80 Years' War. I mean, this thing lasted from 1568 to 1648. There was a decades-long process of slow capturing of major Spanish strongholds throughout the southern Netherlands and by the Dutch Republic. So these things really do take time. Okay, so this is basically where we're at with the timeline, and I'm going to leave it, you know, for other people to get this work done properly, also with the kings. But we can clearly see that this generation problem here is also happening with the kings. And if you go look up in Wikipedia, they also, you know, they mainstream science, they do recognize perhaps these kings. They do, especially Solomon, most certainly, because he was simply the builder of the temple. So that's when you see very hardcore, undeniable archaeological evidence of Israel's existence and dominance in the area. So, but these three generations of the three kings there, that 120 years, you can also start repairing that. And but we have very clearly shown, I think, what happens if you just take what we know now, that Moses was actually died 1177. Everything starts to make sense, and the whole timeline, which was unable to get validated by mainstream history, must have been wrong. What we have done is shown that the Bible was not wrong. Okay, that may be good news or bad news, depending what religion you support. If you believe in the scientism religion, you will be disappointed. If you believe in the Christian religion, you will be excited. And for me, I'm a historian. I take this mainly or entirely as a historian. Okay, I am a Christian, let there be no doubt, but I'm only interested in history, and I do not believe that the Bible is the word of God, even though it is an incredibly important book, an unbelievably important book. And it's not for nothing that it has fascinated so many people for so long, and it is by far the most important book ever written. Nobody in his right mind can deny this, just in terms of the number of times it was printed, read throughout history. So, you know, I'm interested in the history, and I think that the evidence that I have presented here is really completely self-explanatory, really, and it is basically bloody amazing that I have to do it. Let's face it. So anybody can validate and can check everything that I've said, You know, you can make the same calculations. You can read the texts that I've showed you. If you read Joshua, you know, I never read Joshua because it's a boring text in itself. But when I realized that it was in fact the report of the general himself of the Canaanite conquest, I did read it. It still is a boring text because it is just basically a gigantic litany we took this city and we smote everybody. And smote means smite, totally whack everybody. And then it's just an endless list of dozens of cities that they take down in this way. And of course, this creates the question, okay, why so brutal? Why is a loving God telling the Israelites to slaughter everybody? And there are very good answers to these questions. They are important questions, legitimate questions, but there are also very good and legitimate answers to these questions. But I will not be answering them right now. I will be answering them in a later video. But first, I'm now going to post these 5 here. And again, I would like to invite everybody who has made it this far to give this stuff real scrutiny, and also very much in academic circles. I expect it will be ignored by the mainstream, and because you know it is a big shock to mainstream. The mainstream situation is pretty obvious that, you know, atheism and the scientists, the supporters of the scientism religion, because that is just another cult as well, whatever you think of Christianity and Judaism. Very serious criticisms are in order there. Nobody doubts this, and but the same is very much true of the scientism religion, very much so indeed. So and you know, science over the last few centuries, especially since the Enlightenment and especially over the last century, have made a habit of mocking the Bible. And the fact that the Canaanite conquest, the basic claims by Moses in Exodus, in Numbers, in Deuteronomy, about what he was up to, taking Israel out of Egypt into Canaan, that this has never been validated by mainstream history, has been a huge problem for the credibility of the Bible. And that this now is coming to light obviously has gigantic implications, and everybody should get involved in this. And theologians, again, Bible scholars, Christians, Jews, everybody should get involved in this conversation. And I think it is incredibly important, and I think it's wildly fascinating also. So and this is my part for now, and I will be coming back with some conclusions at a later stage, maybe in a few weeks, maybe in a few months, maybe later, but when I feel inspired, and perhaps when there is more dialogue about it all, or maybe when I'm bored. But this is it for now, because this is the facts. This, what I've presented now in these 5 installments, is the introduction. What is at stake? That's the first 2 videos, and in the 3rd video, the clear evidence, and then explaining what went wrong with the biblical timeline, and why this mismatch in mainstream history and biblical history, the biblical narrative, why this occurred. And I think it gives a very comprehensive view, and it must be savored and evaluated on its own merit. Without my further input, I've been trying to be as objective as possible, and I've just been trying to make the case at hand, and all the conclusions are, I think everybody can make his own conclusions, and I think the conclusions are, yeah, brilliant and beautiful, and but let everybody come to his own conclusions. So for now, thank you very much.